I'd just like to say a warm welcome to everybody that's joining us today. I'm very excited to be able to be a part of this panel. I'm not involved in the book, so I'm going to learn as much as anyone else on this call. But I have had a look through it, and it's a really fascinating publication, and really looking forward to the presentations we're about to hear. So welcome, everyone. Just to say that this event is a jointly organised one between the Urban Institute at the University of Sheffield and the Development Planning Unit, or DPU, at UCL. We're going to hear from a few people. In a moment, I'll ask Andrea Rigon to give us a little bit of background on what the origins of this book were. We'll then hear from Tiffany Butcher, Philip Horn, and Vanessa Castonbroto, just talking about their perspectives, their contributions to the book, and we'll end with some discussion. Now, just in terms of housekeeping, we will be taking the questions through the question and answer function. I'm sure many of you have used Zoom more often than you wish you had already, so you'll be well familiar with the Q&A function. But do please, if you're not familiar with it, just click on the Q&A on your screen and you'll see that you can enter a question in there. We won't be using the chat function. So although someone will be keeping an eye on the chat, I won't be. So if you post in chat, it's unlikely that I'll see your question as quickly. Do post questions in the Q&A section when they come to you. There's no need to wait until the discussion at the end. We won't answer them until the end, but the sooner you get on, the sooner we can start looking at making sure that we respond appropriately. So once again, welcome. My name is Michael Walls. I'm the director of the DPU. I'm really excited. I'm always excited by these things because it's really nice to see what my colleagues are doing. It's particularly wonderful in this one to see the range of different contributors to the book, who I think the vast majority of whom I know pretty well, and to be able to see that sort of extended, of course, it's not just DPU, this is Sheffield University as well as UCL, but really see that the extent of that network and family is a really wonderful thing. And to see that group working together on something as topical and important as the issues of social justice, intersectionality, community, the nature of identity in urban development practice is really, I think, a really important moment. So I'll stop there. I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say, but I'd like to hand over first to Andrea Rigon and ask Andrea to give us a little bit of background on where this is all coming from. So Andrea, over to you.
You're on mute, Andrea.
Ah, that would be why I can't hear you.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Michael. Unmuting is always the thing I forgot. So this book is a collective journey that reflects, and you will see this from the table of contents of the different people of this network, that reflects really 15 years of working on inclusive urban development in the Global South. And the book outlines how current thinking on diversity and intersectionality challenges existing practice of urban development, which builds upon a concept of homogeneous community. And the colleagues and the contributors of the book are strong advocates for the role, the key role of urban communities to shape their own development. And although practice is problematic, I think we won the argument, and you can hear governments, development agencies talking of what the community want, the aspirations of the community, and so forth. But in order to make a strong case in the past years against top-down development approaches in cities, and making a case for the role of communities, activists and scholars whose work informs policy and practice have overlooked important considerations on internal power inequalities and diversity in such communities and the challenges that they present. And sometimes we need to think, is it even possible to know what an urban community wants when low-income urban settlements are some of the most unequal places in the world? And some of the core conceptual ideas of the book around identities, diversity, and intersectionality have been discussed for at least a couple of decades, if not longer. However, there has not been an attempt to assess the tension between internal community diversity and the powerful narrative of community as one actor. And the book explores some ways to deal productively with these permanent tensions, without diminishing the importance of collective action built on collective identities. The book explores the challenges and tensions in working with diversity when we want fair outcomes for all urban residents. And we have three main set of questions that we try to address with this book. How do urban development interventions differently affect different groups and individuals? How fairly are the benefits of the intervention distributed within urban communities? And how are the notions of homogeneous static community reproduced in urban planning and development practice, and with what consequence? What are the constraints and power relations that make it difficult for urban planning and development practice to achieve fairer outcomes through the adoption of an intersectional diversity approach? The second set of questions relates to what extent does urban development practice take into account the diversity of needs and aspirations of different groups and individuals? And in what ways does diversity and intersectionality theory contribute to understanding urban communities and the diversity of needs and aspiration of individuals and groups? And finally, what new alternatives for urban development practice emerge from critiques of community representation and intersectional analysis? Are there new methodologies emerging that enables fairer forms of representation and meaningful participation of marginalized groups and individuals? And the theme running through all contributions is that diversity matters. And we have identified three interlinked aspects of diversity that broadly corresponds to the three dimensions of social justice in Nancy Fraser's work. One is around the recognition of the diversity of aspirations and needs that requires different interventions. A second point is around redistribution and has to do with the diversity of the impact of interventions on different groups and individuals. And finally, participation, the diversity in participation to decision making. The book is structured in three parts. Chapters in the first part highlight how community diversity and intersectionality matter. The second part explores the impact of planning interventions on diverse communities. And the third part maps out the space of possibility for just urban development, particularly exploring promising approaches and methodologies. And the contribution to this book and from this wide network of people are very diverse. In terms of geography, they move from Dhaka to Hong Kong, Accra, Cape Town, La Paz, Harare, Bar Elias in Lebanon, Kathmandu, Freetown, Banjarmasin in Indonesia, and they focus on different intersectional identities, for example, disability, gender, class, ethnicity, age, and others, and they start from different disciplinary perspectives. And it is this diversity of input, it is really creating this wider network of people and approaches that make the book unique. And from this diversity of perspective, we are trying to advance our understanding of these complex relationships. And you will hear now a couple of examples of this broad diversity before hearing some kind of conclusion that we are drawing from the book.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I'd like to invite now Tiffany Butcher to tell us a little bit about her contribution. And thanks to Tiffany for joining us from Melbourne. It's late at night, so I think it shows a certain amount of dedication to be up here with us on this presentation. So Tiffany, over to you.
Thanks very much, Michael. How could I miss it? Thanks very much to Vanessa and Andrea as well for kind of putting together this initiative. I think it's the sort of book that I really wish I had when I was doing my PhD. And so it's an amazing thing to actually be a part of creating that process. So really nice to be here. I'm just gonna share my screen. And how do I? Okay. Brilliant. All right, so I'm sharing a couple of thoughts from my chapter, which I've written, which is called Infrastructural Relations, Participation and Diversity in Community-Based Water Management. And that is looking at the case of Kathmandu in Nepal. And this is based on my PhD fieldwork. I am, yeah, I'll say also I'm Tiffany Butcher, obviously a postdoc at the Connected Cities Lab. So in this chapter, I'm really trying to examine the links between, oh, it's doing a kind of automatic thing. Examining the links between community participation in urban services and the broader aims of urban equality. So speaking very much to those dimensions of recognition, representation, distribution, while also heeding the words of feminists to try and understand and break open this notion of the homogenous idea of the community, as well as how community-based structures may both embody old or even produce new inequitable social power relations. And ultimately trying to link an identity-based analysis with an analysis of, in my case, water vulnerabilities, but I think you could probably replace water with any different type of sort of more sectorial intervention. So just very briefly on Kathmandu, it is a relatively small but growing capital city. Importantly for this case, 63% of residents living in the informal settlements of the city lack any access to municipal piped water in the settlements. And even those who do have piped water, sorry, it's doing some automatic thing. Even those who do have access to piped water, it's actually quite variable. It's not, it's of a very poor quality. So even that is quite low. Kathmandu is also a super diverse city across languages, cultures, ethnicities, and caste, as well as having very deep-seated legacies of social exclusions, which were baked into educational systems, political systems, and linguistic systems. So that comes to bear in this case as well. This is just a couple of shots of some of the informal settlements of Kathmandu. Most of them are located alongside the major riverways of the city. Land is very scarce, so mostly the only places left are these kind of riverbank areas with, of course, as you can see here, many of the challenges associated with solid waste management, health, flooding, and the risks linked with that. So in the absence of municipal supply, the most common way which residents are able to access water, either in informal settlements or even in kind of more formal dwellings, is through this system of usually 5,000 liter water tanks. These water tanks are filled by these tankers that you see on the right, which are either, so sort of deep drilling done just outside the city limits, deeply unecological, but that's another issue, either supplied by the municipal authorities or in many cases by sort of private water tankers, which take on their own sort of water mafia style issues as well. So what I'd like to share with you today is just a couple of thoughts from one single settlement in which I work. So it's a very micro level study called Banksighat. Banksighat is one of the oldest, as well as one of the largest settlements in the city, which actually is not that old and not that large compared to many other places. It was importantly sort of settled on the eastern side of the settlement first, and that's because the land there was a higher quality. And then the lower lying western side, which is much more prone to flooding, it's sort of just adjacent to a river, it gained population some 30 years following the sort of growth of the eastern side. And that happened at a really important moment. It was a sort of post-conflict, post-Civil War moment. A lot of rural to urban migration happened at that time. The kind of Maoist Communist Party took power. And I think this sort of uneasy negotiation of a post-conflict setting and the kind of wave of migration that came at this moment, it sets the scene also for some of the dynamics and some of the tensions that happen in Banksighat. It is also, like most of Kathmandu, a highly diverse population across caste, class, and ethnicity, as well as, importantly, in the last 10 years or so, a new and rapidly growing rental population. So again, with the scarcity of land, existing houses starting to subdivide and rent out to newer migrants as they continue to come to the city. I'll also mention there is a small minority ethnic group called the Madesi. And what I found in Banksighat is they were living primarily in the southwestern quadrant of the settlement. And what that means is the most marginal land, closest to the riverside, lowest lying. And this is actually a pattern that's been found in many other settlements as well, that many of these kind of Madesi residents are often in the most marginal areas. And this, again, is a very long history of social exclusion, which I won't get into today, but essentially Madesi residents often excluded from political positions, education, they speak a different language, often actually, even to this day, still have trouble accessing Nepalese citizenship. So it is quite a challenging set of conditions. As a result of these kind of spatial patterns and migration patterns and all of these different social things at play, Banksighat it actually looks quite different from one side to the next. So you have some houses which are looking quite formal, have sort of brick houses, 2-story balconies, relatively sort of moderated. There's a big road for access for fire trucks, but you also have at the same time, particularly on the western side of the settlement, much denser conditions. You can see here a very narrow little laneway, single doors where you might have multiple families living in one room, single, without windows, without ventilation. So very, very poor conditions and very different conditions. So what I'd like to talk to you today is about this kind of innovative community managed water system. In 2007, with the shift to privatization in the city, there was a lot of advocacy, including from the women's group, the Women's Federation of the Urban Poor, Mahila Ekta Samaj, which means women together, and they began advocating for better services in their settlement. As a part of this kind of ongoing advocacy in collaboration with many others, 4 of those massive water tanks were brought into the settlement in 2 different phases. And you can see a little map here, and sort of they call them tanks A through E. So tanks A and B were brought first in the eastern side, and then C and D more to the middle and the east a couple of years later. And then tank E came much, much later, just from a charity that subsidized it. As a part of this process, a new department was created. There we go again. Was created in the utility, with the agreement that they would subsidize the cost of the water tanks for half price and somehow regulate the quality. And then, of course, that water, as in many cases, would then be managed and resold by water users groups. So what I think is very interesting for me is I wanted to try and understand the extent to which this community managed system was able to deliver on many of those promises around empowerment, around community management that we see in a lot of that kind of NGO literature. And I think what's very interesting about this case is that it is very successful according to many different metrics. And so, the ways in which the community, the Federation has sort of managed, particularly their tanks A and B, you've seen things like greater recognition and respect from local councillors. You've seen, of course, material benefits from greater quantity and quality of water, particularly, of course, many of the women sort of household managers, as they would often refer to themselves, sort of explicitly identifying that as benefits to them. Very interestingly, you were seeing, particularly in those first 2 tanks, A and B on the east, which were managed by the Federation, they were able to recoup some of the financial benefits from reselling the water, and they invested that into broader communal goods, like a community center that was in the center of the settlement. You definitely saw some really strong examples of transformation in gender relations, the ways in which many of these sort of women managers spoke of the pride, fearlessness, political and social recognition, in their households, in the neighborhood, and in the city from their leadership. Though this also did come with some risks, some threats, some violence, it's important to mention. Something else very interesting, which I won't talk much about, but there was a real sort of literal increase in tenure security by using the sort of bills and bill payment as a way of demonstrating their longevity in the settlement. And that was actually used quite effectively in protesting an eviction event. And ultimately, I think in many ways, it shows us a highly successful example of advocacy around rights in the context of privatization. And I like very much this quote here from one of the community leaders, who talks about the ways in which they built relationships with the local authorities through this project, with some threats, some deceit, some jokes, and some requests. However, I think I'll just highlight a couple of sort of, I guess, vignettes about the ways in which, the sort of very uneven ways in which this project was being experienced. So while tanks A and B, which were managed by the Federation, were working quite well, what you saw with tanks C and D is that they were managed only by individual families. And this is because in the second phase of the program, there was a requirement for a 40% contribution, financial contribution, to go towards the installation costs of the tanks. So of course, only the families that had the willingness to stay, had the financial means, were able to contribute to that. And so then they run the tanks as a business, not as a community facility. And while this had some sort of benefits, particularly again for those women managers about autonomy, for instance, it did mean they weren't able to kind of leverage on those relational gains with the local authorities. So talking about being less able to hold water vendors to account. And of course, then that last tank was even completely unable to access the municipal subsidy. So really totally out of that program. And what's interesting about the ways in which this plays out is that maps onto a series of pre-existing social tensions around those differences between east and west of the settlement. So, when I asked very much around these kind of differences of how this management was happening, I was often faced with this kind of commentary. On the east, most people have struggled a lot to help form the settlement and contributed to the development scene today. And so what you sort of got then is, because the tanks on the west were sort of run as a business, they were located next to the families that sort of owned them, it fed into the perception that these tanks, and therefore those newer migrants who were managing those tanks, were badly managed and not good citizens. And this was not really about the water tanks, but was actually tapping into this kind of uneasy situation in a post-conflict era. The other sort of major exclusions was really around renters. So renters were explicitly identified across the settlement from any of the tank managers as not really welcome to join this kind of program. And this was identified very understandably as an issue of both sustainability and viability. So in a context in which Kathmandu was sort of rapidly going through a lot of urban change, a lot of environmental degradation, impacting water sources, a lot of urban growth, and no real kind of continuation of that program in the municipality, no real ability to scale that out, then of course there's no possibility of actually including those renters. And I think this kind of notion, again, from a community leader was quite striking. We've worked hard to make our places nice. Now, as the rental population has increased drastically, it makes it hard to keep things nice as they are. How can we help the rest? And I think this idea of how can we help the rest is a really important one that we need to reckon with in some of these interventions. And so what you were then seeing is, while some renters were able to maneuver, the ones who were most vulnerable or the poorest were engaging in a lot of practices like severely suppressing consumption, postponing certain activities, or using even the highly polluted riverside. And then the last sort of thing I just want to raise is the issue of the Madesi residents. And over, what I heard from these residents was, besides water, we're not included in any development activities. This is because we are renters, but it is also because we are Madesi. So explicitly identifying these exclusions at the intersection of these two identities. So the most extreme deprivations were faced by Madesi renters, which was a combination of a series of different things. But what was really interesting for me is the ways in which some of these exclusions from services was, on the one hand, leading to substandard practices such as using the riverside for the toilet, bathing, etc., which then in turn leads to further discrimination. So, often, when I tried to inquire around this, what I would hear was, oh, the Madesis, they come here, they make a mess. When, of course, I speak to the residents, I say, well, yes, we do these things. We eat outside because we don't have room in our houses. We use the riverside as a toilet because we don't actually have access to the facilities. We can't actually access the water to clean our toilet. So if we wanted to pay, they wouldn't even let us. And this had really different impacts across both women and men, Madesi women and men, of course, in different ways. And what was interesting about that, and quite difficult, I think, is that the vulnerabilities for these Madesi renters both remained or even intensified then with this increased recognition, respect, and services. So as the settlement became more consolidated, these substandard practices became even more problematic and looked even less sort of citizenly, orderly, and were sort of adding to these layers of discrimination. And I know I'm a bit over time, so just these last implications. Linking water user groups, I think, with a broad-based community organization, it was, I think, in many ways key to broader democratic claims. So the fact that this Federation of the Urban Poor, which had this more democratic structure in the settlement beyond water, it was successful in leveraging on that to create a lot of possibilities for that settlement. On the other hand, it is also clear that this water program intersected with pre-existing social inequalities. And I believe in a way the tanks are somehow a material representation of this longer struggle of legitimacy, citizenliness, and sort of who belongs in the settlement. Importantly, the financial requirements in this program was really exclusionary, and that's important because a lot of water programs still have that language of financial contribution generates a sense of ownership, and that can be quite exclusionary, especially for, of course, renters, new migrants, people who aren't able to pay, as well as the inability to either expand the program or draw in further support from the municipality limited the scale out, and I think really undermined some of the solidarities in the settlement that might have otherwise been able to kind of flourish. And ultimately, as I said before, the vulnerabilities for the Madesi renters remained or even intensified. And this is really linked with the ways in which these water vulnerabilities are being produced through social context. And that is where I'll stop.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. I really like that you sort of seem to be presenting from a jungle there. It gives a certain backdrop to the presentation. Thanks for that, it was really interesting. I'd like to ask Philip now to do a little presentation on your contribution to the book.
Thank you very much. And just can I check that everybody can see the slides? Perfect. So first of all, thank you very much to Andrea and to Vanessa for inviting me to contribute a chapter to a really exciting book. I think this all began in 2018 at a panel which Andrea organized, and it's nice to sort of see this journey unfolding and coming to an end with this really lovely looking book, which I'll certainly recommend to my students and colleagues also here at the University of Sheffield. So my name is Philip Horn. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at Sheffield, and I'll be presenting some of the key insights from my chapter in this book today. So essentially focusing on the city of La Paz in Bolivia, where I have been working collaboratively with a number of groups that identify themselves as indigenous throughout the last, I think, almost 10 years. The chapter I present in this book deploys an intersectionality framework to explore specific processes through which meanings of being indigenous are constructed in urban contexts in Bolivia, but I think it resonates with wider debates around indigeneity in the Latin American context. So I deploy an intersectionality framework, drawing on some of the sort of more dominant Black feminist voices emerging from the United States, but also on Bolivian scholars like Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, who apply what I would consider related frameworks that are more relevant to the Bolivian context. And in the chapter, I deploy a combined intra and intercategorical intersectionality approach. So by intracategorical, I try to unpack a bit this master category of indigeneity and look at it in the context of a neglected place, which I argue is the urban. And here I contrast both official political representations of indigeneity to those of people who self-identify as indigenous. And then I also deploy an intercategorical approach, looking at the intersections between residency status, age, or gender, to decipher some of the power differentials and inequalities that exist within indigenous communities, all with the idea to really highlight and contribute to debates around indigeneity that consider this category fluid, differential, contested, and constantly changing. So let me reflect on some of the key insights of the chapter. So first of all, why urban indigeneity? It's nothing new. If we look at pre-colonial histories of the Americas and of Bolivia in particular, we can think of urban settlements like Tiwanaku. We can think of Tuqueyapu, which is today's La Paz. It was an urban settlement long before colonial times. We can think of Grigota, which was an indigenous urban settlement prior to it becoming Santa Cruz after the colonial conquest. We also know that indigenous peoples never lived statically in one place, but oftentimes in a multi-local residency pattern, inhabiting different socio-ecological floors, which in Bolivia are referred to as aylus, meaning you keep a piece of land in the highlands where you engage in agricultural activities, but you also try to have a foothold in market centers, or in other words, in cities to trade goods. And throughout the 20th century and the 21st century, indigenous peoples increasingly migrate to cities, but the urban is also coming closer to their home turf. So there's various reasons which I explore in the chapter, ranging from climate change to neoliberal reforms, which have contributed to agricultural decline, the increasing displacement of indigenous peoples from their territory due to the expansion of the extractive frontier, deforestation and violent conflict, but also just simply people's aspirations to search for better economic and social opportunities in cities. But I also argue that urban features are increasingly emerging within rural indigenous territories. And I depict here a road which is supposed to go through an indigenous territory called Tipnis. And for those of you familiar with Bolivia, have probably heard about how this road construction process polarized society. So considering then that the majority of those who identify as indigenous live in the city, or that urbanization is arriving in indigenous territory near you, I was interested in the chapter to explore how does that resonate with official political and legal representations of indigeneity. And the claim I'm making essentially is that current dominant political and legal representations of indigeneity in Bolivia, but not just in Bolivia, I would say across the globe, must be understood in relation to the colonial past, and in the context of Latin America, certainly ongoing patterns of coloniality. So in Latin America and Bolivia, colonizers constructed a system of ethnospatial stratification following a system of blood politics, whereby cities were constructed as planned, predominantly white spaces or for people of mixed blood, who are granted with citizenship rights, access to services, etc., etc. In contrast, the countryside or nature, the rural hinterlands of the colonies were conceived of as native places, native territories, indigenous spaces, where the indigenous population oftentimes worked in semi-feudal conditions, but was also denied from citizenship rights, and at the same time perhaps granted some political autonomy over internal community affairs. And I'll unpack this notion of community a bit later. The point I'm making in the chapter is that this sort of urban-rural dichotomy persists until the present. So we can see that at the level of international organizations, at the level of the UN, where indigeneity is oftentimes associated with ancestral rural territories. We can see it in campaigns that represent indigenous peoples as guardians of the forest. I don't want to say that this is in itself problematic, but the argument I'm making is that it ignores an important proportion that no longer lives in the forest, but perhaps in the concrete jungle. And this is also apparent in Bolivia's apparent plurinational, decolonial, and pro-indigenous government. And here my research really aligns with Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui's anti-colonial critique of the decolonial Bolivian project, in the way that I highlight that coloniality is actually reproduced in this current context. And this is particularly evident in the treatment of indigenous peoples through the so-called category of indigenous native peasants, which again associates indigeneity not with the city. And this is evident here in a quote that I include from the Deputy Minister of Decolonial Affairs, who, ironically, considering his position, reproduces colonial understandings of cities as modern non-indigenous spaces and the countryside as the native indigenous space. So I then contrast that to the everyday experiences and multiple realities of those people who self-identify as indigenous and live in the city of La Paz, which is the seat of the national government and one of the more major cities in the country. And what I really highlight is that there's not just one articulation of indigeneity, but multiple ones. So we increasingly identify an Aymara bourgeoisie, so the Aymara are the predominant indigenous group within the city, who might still engage in informal economic activities, but have increasingly generated wealth and inhabit more upper class neighborhoods, also drawing on their own architectural principles, as you can see in the image by Freddy Mamani, who's a famous Aymara architect. We can also depict in this context that people have different relationships to the city. Some live there permanently, some temporary, and people express their identity in very different ways. Some by revitalizing traditions through folkloric parades, as you can see in the middle picture, which are seen as a way of taking over the white city, but at the same time, especially younger people trying to fuse modern culture like hip hop or techno or graffiti with Aymara language. And what I'm arguing in the book is that this combination of the indigenous and the urban sort of coexists without ever mixing. And Kuzikanki refers to that as Czechi. And a core feature that unites all of the people I've been working with is that they identify their identity in relation to land, public space, and territory, and raise claims both for specific indigenous rights around self-governance and collective territory in prior consultation, but also for universal rights to shelter, tenure, security, and basic services. And they want to claim these rights by being involved in decision-making processes according to their own governance principles. And in the slightly longer book I've written about this topic, I define this as indigenous rights to the city because it resonates, but also differentiates in ways Lefebvre and advocates define the right to the city. So let me now spend 1 or 2 more minutes, and sorry, I'm also slightly running over on the intercategorical complexities. And this is something that came out when working with so-called indigenous communities, and particularly with youth activists in these communities. And a key thing is that different members, and especially youths, highlight that there exist uneven power relations, and that elderly men in particular play more dominant roles within their communities. And the justifications for these issues vary. Some blame it on the implications of colonial and Catholic gender values, and that resonates with Maria Lugones's understanding of the coloniality of gender. Others highlight that gerontocracy and gender relations are based around indigenous principles like the Aymara term chachawami. But be it rooted in indigenous worldviews or in the coloniality of gender, young women in particular highlight that they feel misrepresented by their leaders, accuse them of personally benefiting from their role as leaders, dividing communities, and excluding them. And I tried to highlight that here in this slightly longer quote, which I'm not going to read out. So I finished the chapter, in a sense, by focusing on the practices of young indigenous women who have started raising their voice against sexism, against domestic violence, against abuse within indigenous communities, but also against the coloniality that still exists within the city. They do this by joining citywide and regional feminist networks like Mujeres Creando or Ni Una Menos, which are grounded in an anarcho-feminist approach, but also by forming their own organizations. And I'm currently running an ESRC New Investigator project that accompanies some of the practices of these organizations in further detail from a distance due to the pandemic. But let me conclude then by making the same statement that I also make in the end of the chapter, and that is essentially that there's a need to explore a bit more how representatives within indigenous communities lay the groundwork for new urban indigenous politics, which not only confronts unjust practices that reproduce ethno-racial exclusion and coloniality, but which also problematize patriarchal relations and intergenerational conflict within these urban indigenous communities itself. So I'll leave it with that, and happy to answer any questions when they arise. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Philip. And on the note of questions, can I encourage, I see someone's already posted a question in the Q&A section. Please do post questions there. we will come to that as soon as we've finished the presentations, and Vanessa will be the last presentation before we move on to the discussion. So do post your questions in the Q&A section so we can get to them shortly. Vanessa, please go ahead with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for coming here on the day of the eclipse. It's kind of a special day, not just because of the launch, but like our whole world seems to be kind of conjuring to create exciting things around us. And thank you very much to Andrea. It's the first person I have to thank because he invited me to do this book with him, and I was so pleased, and I've enjoyed it so much, and I've learned so much. But I have to acknowledge that actually Andrea has been working on these areas during so long, and he's really been a leading force and a dynamic force in the project. And I have to thank Stephanie and Philip, not only for the beautiful presentations they've done today, but also for their amazing contributions to the book. But they are not the only ones. There are other 11 chapters, and everyone is amazing. Everyone, there are some chapters that have a massive richness base of empirical data. There are other ones that are more conceptual and perhaps a little bit normative and a little bit of what does this mean in practice, which was our purpose from the beginning of the book since I joined, to relate these complex debates about what is community, what is intersectionality, with what do we do in practice when we think about urban development. So about a year ago, Andrea and I had read all the chapters, we're super excited, but we were saying, yes, but we need something to finish this. We need to find an angle that brings all together because, okay, we understand the questions, we understand why they're important, but how do we move from this? How do we move from this? I think both Stephanie and Philip have illustrated the complexities that we face and the fact that there are not easy ready-made answers for any of these questions. So we were thinking, how do we bring, what have we learned, basically? So I think we may have taken a very obvious route, which was asking to one of the persons that we know better, that she knows best how to learn about things, how to get the big picture. So we asked Karen Levy to join us to finish this conclusion. So what we did was to sit down together, the three of us, go through all the chapters and discuss them and try to get the threads, try to say, what are the main questions? What are the main findings? What can we bring forward? So from that discussion, now I'm embarrassing myself with my use of Zoom. Why is the slide not going? Okay, is there? What we were consumed by, the three of us, was by this tension. So on the one hand, most of these contributions show that community is an identity, it can build this, it can constitute an identity to support emancipatory political movements. And it can help to bring people together to advance collective goals towards emancipation and liberation. So community can be useful, but at the same time, communities are themselves shaped by this tension between individual and collective identities. And community is itself a value-laden concept and is open to appropriation and may erase people's experiences. And I think, for example, the case of indigenous identities and that tension between displaying indigeneity and the way indigenous identities also reproduce certain forms of patriarchy. Sorry, Philip, if I don't conceptualize it very rightly. They show that inherent contradiction. So how do we work with this tension? So what we found is perhaps what is useful is to think about community identity, obviously not as something that is there for us to observe and measure, and particularly not as categories that you can measure and overlap, and even putting in a GIS, as somebody told me once, even putting them on a map, I don't think it's a great idea, but instead community identity is a moving target. and is characterized by these two features. One is their simultaneity. So identities, they don't happen in isolation. In fact, identity is just the description of a moment, an emergence feature of a person. But actually there's in one person or in a group of persons, so you can have a concurrent manifestation of different forms of what we would call identities. And on the other hand, identities are not ever fixed, they are fluid, they are ever changing. In fact, often they require performing those identities. And this is something that is particularly strong in queer theory and in the performance of gender. So to reinforce who you are and how you understand yourself. So maybe the identity is more like an orientation. I very much like Sarah Ahmed's work on queer phenomenology and how we orient ourselves and how certain orientations facilitate our life. And also in communities, identity is part of that orientation, part of that kind of energy and kind of relationship with everything around us. Not just political relations and institutional relations, but as Stephanie well shown, material relations that orient our bodies and orient our dynamics in a way that we can create political projects or not. So from reading together all the 14 fantastic chapters, we got these 3 key insights. One is that questions of community are closely related with issues of representation. But a very important insight is that you can represent different identities, but presence is not the same as voice. And this raises a lot of questions. So it's not just about who is in the room, but how that room creates different voices and enables different voices and facilitates that some voices are heard or not, and how far that room can extend beyond the normal spaces where the communities have agency. Another aspect which is common to all these chapters is this emphasis on action and this idea that communities are agents of change, but that those dynamics of change are always ambiguous, not only because any change has differential impacts, but also because that change has to constantly be made visible. And it may be visible in different ways that advance some political projects and not others. And finally, there's of course a question of power. Power is a favorite theme of all of us. And we probably took most of our discussion between Andrea, Karen, and I, this idea that how do we deal with power? And perhaps that we tend to think that a depoliticized context in which there's no power is the best. So people say, oh, but communities have power dynamics. Some people dominate others. But in fact, societies have power dynamics. So power is inherent to any kind of social situation. And if we are going to intervene, we better engage with those dynamics of power and with how it's deployed on a space and on neighborhoods and on households, than rather avoiding those dynamics of power and trying to ignore that they exist. But perhaps because of the influence of Karen, we were pushed to think a bit more beyond these general kind of conclusions. And we thought, can we give practical recommendations about how to deal with these difficult conundrums? So one idea that we have is to build some sort of inventory of tactics to build solidarity across difference. It's a very nice phrase. But so if you go towards the end of the book, we made this long table with all kinds of tactics that we see that are displayed through the chapters in the book. And for every tactic, we thought about how does it advance emancipatory goals, but also what are the limits to its tactic. One thing to say is that we can make an inventory like that, maybe interesting, but I mean, if you translate this into policy tools, it's not going to work. This inventory is like it's a reflection rather than a list of things that you can do or a menu or something. In fact, even if it's an inventory, is permanently in progress, it's permanently unfinished and in the making. But some of these tactics, they once and again appear in the kind of work that is reflected in this book. So for example, a lot of critical work has tried to make communities visible, and from specific strategies like collective mapping are common. But some more critical work, like for example, Jasmine Abibi-Jones' work tracing the colonial history in Hong Kong and kind of explaining how different populations are made visible or not. Or Jordana Ramallo and Sylvia Chan's chapter on the missing girls on slums. But what all these chapters that try to make things visible have in common is that they all call for this need to move beyond additive approaches between this kind of overlapping identities that some people sometimes use in practice. One thing is that making voices visible is not the same as strategies that deliberately attempt to build presence and voice. Strategies to create multiple arenas of engagement, to understand the sometimes unexpected ways in which communities gain power, and find ways to articulate what remains specifically silence in a context and a situation. So they may be very related, but actually in practice they are quite different. And then perhaps other strategies may be more focused on creating political momentum, strengthen social mobilization. So Stephanie's example is one, but perhaps also Afena's experience in the community of Old Fadama in Ghana. It has a very strong analysis of how communities organize and disorganize to create some certain political momentum. And that's where in these processes of social mobilization is where you see some voices that can be more dominant than others. And of course, there were also a lot of proposals in these chapters to create kind of material projects and demonstrations of what was possible. And the idea that you can create a little initiative and plant a seed that would challenge the status quo, and the extent to which those seeds can challenge that status quo and generate new policy dialogues. But one thing that the book raises in relation to previous analysis of this kind of approach to community urban development is that even small projects like that, small experiments and small exercises in co-production and co-design have a need for conflict resolution. So this is just a flavor. There were more in the long table that we appended at the end of the chapter. But basically what I wanted to highlight with all of this was the need to learn across all these chapters and across all these contexts. And just give again the thanks to all our collaborators, and let's continue building solidarity across difference. We are also very different, all of us can work towards that goal. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Vanessa, for a really interesting presentation. All of the presentations were fascinating. We have a few questions, but before we go to questions, I think it's important that we just say something about the fact that the book is dedicated to one of our contributors, who unfortunately, of course, can't be with us, hence the dedication. And I'd just like to ask Andrea to say a few words about Sylvia Chant, who is the focus of the dedication.
Yes, thank you, Michael. As Michael said, Sylvia Chant was working with Jordana Ramallo, has been working on one of the chapters, but she passed away before publication. And it's not only that, but her pioneering work on gender in informal settlements has profoundly shaped the ideas of this book and inspired all of us. Her work was one of the first works I've encountered opening this kind of field for me as a student, as a PhD student. And I think she was one that strongly encouraged this project since the beginning, and she was on top of her work, her pioneering work, inspiring a lot in this field. She was also a close friend of many of us who wrote this book, and many of us who are actually in the audience today. So for that, we really want to, to thank and think about her and her memory dedicating this book. And I just want to add that a special thanks also from my side to all the contributors, because this book was put together under very difficult conditions through the first part of the pandemic. And I think it was, we really owe a lot to all the people. And of course, one thanks to Vanessa, who made the book possible. The book wouldn't be here without Vanessa. And just to say also an additional special thanks to Karen Levy, who not only helped us making sense of all this contribution in the conclusion, but her thinking also underpins so much of this book and can be found in so many contributions and parts of the book. So again, it was a massive privilege for me to be able to work with Vanessa and Karen.
Great, thank you, Andrea. Now, I do want to move now to the questions and answers and the discussion. So please, we've got 3 questions on the Q&A function. But if you have a question, please can you post it there? We will get to it in just a moment. I wonder if I might sort of slightly abuse my chair's role and ask actually a question, ask if each of the presenters could maybe hold on to this question and answer it when you come to answer the first question you deal with. And that's one of the things that struck me in looking through the book and the research questions the book was trying to answer, was that the first and third research questions are very much about trying to understand the effects development interventions have on urban development practices, what are emergent in terms of practices, what effect they have on people. Those are great questions, and I think there's some really rich material on those in the book. The second question, my question is, the second research question is, to what extent does urban development practice, and I'm paraphrasing, but does it account for diversity? I wonder whether that question is not always inevitably going to be answered the same way, as in, to some extent, but to a greatly varying extent, depending on the specific circumstance we're talking about. My question is to each of the presenters: do you derive any conclusion from your work on the book, or more broadly, that would give an answer that is more specific or leads us to some kind of conclusion on how urban development practice can account for diversity better? So if you can hold on to that question, because I'm going to now go to the questions here. That's something I was just interested in, some reflection from each of the presenters when you come to answer. So the first question, I think, is clearly for, it's clearly for Stephanie, because it's from Nafay Chaudhry about the Madesi, asking, do you get a sense that they consider themselves as a community within the wider communities within which they live? And is there any political organizing within them which helps them access or demand greater rights or resource access? So perhaps, Stephanie, if you can start with that, and perhaps also your reflection on the second research question, that would be great. And then we'll come to the next 2 questions shortly.
Sure. Thanks very much for that question. I think I'll never forget, and probably one of the most maybe difficult but also powerful moments was when I spoke to a young man who said, and my work was actually sort of framed around the idea of citizenship, and he said to me, what does it mean that I have struggled for so long and for so hard to get this citizenship card for me to not even be considered Nepali here? And I think that sort of sense of deep exclusion, not just from where he was living, but also from even the city or country, was really profound and says a lot about that sense of, do people feel like they are a part of a community? And that was sort of echoed in so many other ways. Many of these Madesi residents, for instance, I heard plenty of stories of people who tried to settle in these settlements. So actually all of the Madesi sort of people that I met were renting, and that's not a coincidence. It's because many people tried to settle in the settlement when there was still land freely available to build their own plots of land, and then, you know, some 10, 20 years back were chased out, actually, and kind of houses burned down, violent, you know, a lot of different sort of really difficult stories. And so those residents who had come back, it was sort of in a second wave where actually they were finding that they could, you know, rent out a sort of small space for themselves. So I think there was a number of different ways in which these exclusions were being seen in really sort of material and also quite symbolic ways. That being said, you know, this is a part of a much wider and very complex history of Nepal, where, you know, the part of the story is that the Madhesi community is, unlike many, you know, unlike many of the sort of diversity of Nepal, which is quite scattered and across many different of the 75 different regions, the Madhesi residents live in quite a concentrated area, geographical area. And so there is, of course, a very strong sort of, maybe separatist isn't quite the right word, but, you know, with the shift in 2015, there was a new constitution, new districts were being drawn, and there was a very strong sort of Madhesi push for more autonomy in that region and more recognition as a result of being kind of systematically excluded over time. So there is a very strong political organization, but that's happening in a very different way. And it's traditionally, you know, from what I was sort of feeling, was much more around the political structures and much more concentrated around that region. And what I was really struggling with is I couldn't find organizations based in Kathmandu that were doing that type of work to really look at the particular issues faced by Madhesi residents. And that was really different when you looked at things like caste. Plenty of organizations that were doing a lot of different work, plenty of social kind of programs, educational programs, radio programs, lots of different things were happening. And people sort of talked about caste in a slightly different way because of that. You know, that's a practice that we did in the rural areas. Now we know, you know, we've gone through these programs, so we know we shouldn't talk about it in this way. And actually, what I was really finding is this kind of Madhesi community, though having this very strong sort of dissent moment, and really actually there was a lot of, even recently, there was a lot of different protests, quite violent, that have erupted around it, not really finding the ways of sort of translating that into different forms of advocacy, or even just addressing the sort of very material needs of people. So yeah, sort of long, complex issue. Michael, can I just hang on to your question and come back? Like, can we hang on to it for the end? Because I feel it's quite a nice, I don't know, I want a bit more time to think about it, but.
You're welcome to hang on to the end. And just to repeat it for the other two, same thing, if you want to hang on to it until the end, that's fine. I'm interested in just to what extent and in what ways can urban development practice account for diversity. It does seem like an overarching question, which is critical to the book, to the thrust of the book. So the second question is from Marcelo Belbo.
Michael, can I follow up on Stephanie? Stephanie,
I was going to ask you, Vanessa, anyway, to answer this one.
Just to follow on Stephanie, because she was explaining so well the political struggles of people to have their identity being recognized, and the ways in which perhaps the idea of community can help or not. I just wanted to contrast Stephanie's example with another chapter of the former farm workers in Zimbabwe, which is a chapter which is written by Julius Musevensi and Barbara Chibamushure. I mean, apologies, I'm always a bit unsure of the names. I wonder how my mind cannot remember them. I had to look at them. I think that speaks a lot about our prejudices as well, how we remember some names and others, and how we are conditioned to remember some and others. But anyway, I think they explain really well how the colonial history exclude them and didn't allow them to recognize, didn't have them recognized as having their own identity. And I would invite you to compare both chapters of Stephanie and Julius and Barbara, because they speak to each other so well. Thank you, sorry.
No, that's okay. Stay there, because the next question's for you from Marcelo. It's really basically, and if I'm paraphrasing horribly, you can read, everyone can read, I think, the whole thing when I click answer live. But Marcelo is asking, is community actually a useful analytical concept, given the amorphous, changing nature of it that you described so well in your presentation? So Vanessa, what do you think? Is community actually a useful analytical concept?
Yeah, I would also ask Andrea to contribute to this, because I'm sure he has to say a lot, but I do think it is very useful analytical concept, and politically it can be employed in some context to really create different forms of action. And I'll give you just a very straightforward example that you know I'm going to say, like when we talk about community-based adaptation for climate change. I mean, it makes such a difference to have that paradigm because the alternatives are really terrible. And at the moment, community-based adaptation is for me the only kind of response that can provide a kind of a certainty of justice delivered alongside the adaptation action. Other forms of adaptation tend to have really divisionary impacts. I mean, I'm talking very broadly because obviously adaptation could be many things. But yes, community, it can be a very important, particularly politically, a very important concept. So we shouldn't just discard it. It's these concepts that are difficult are sometimes the most useful. I think that's the problem. Things that are analytically very, very tight and very, very kind of, and you can attribute them very clearly to things, they tend not to be so useful, particularly in policy making or decision making environments, or in places where you can have an influence on people and help towards emancipatory goals.
Okay, thank you. Andrea, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, analytically, I'm more skeptical on this, and I try not to use it so much. I think politically, I think it's a very useful concept. So I use it when I'm doing advocacy, when I say the type of development I want to policymakers, to UN people, or whatever. But analytically, I found it problematic. And very often, because it's been so much abused with this idea of homogenizing things, I found it difficult. So I prefer to talk about grassroots collective action, talking about collective action, collective identities. And I do think collective identities are fundamental to shape demands, and political system can only respond to aggregate demands, cannot respond to very complex individuals, intersectional and fluid identity. So if it's fantastic that we have these grassroots processes that aggregate these collective demands and bring those together, but I think sometimes this overuse of community and thinking that that there is a demand of that specific community is problematic. So I try to use residents of a settlement if I'm talking about a geographical place, rather than using that connotation, or grassroots collective action if I'm talking about these people coming together to act as an analytical concept. Then again, I think because community is such a successful concept and politically so useful, sometimes I use it in that way. But yeah, I find it particularly problematic unless there is, a disclaimer. So we use it in this book, but the whole book is about interrogating the concept. So that's why it works within this book. But I would find it, in a different context, more difficult without these disclaimers.
Okay, thanks, Andrea. Thanks both of you for thought-provoking answers. All of the questions we've got so far about community. If anyone else, which is great, fine, no problem. If anyone has any more questions, please can you post them? The next one comes from Colin, and I would like Philip to direct this to you first. And I think the nub of the question is, how is it possible to guard against solidarity amongst groups within communities becoming something that could be considered regressive? Philip.
Thank you. That's a good and tricky question, in a sense that I think, having worked with, I think worked more with people who would actually say that they're not necessarily, I think that most of the people I've been working with would say they belong to multiple communities or multiple collectives, and I think very much challenging this idea of everything representing a homogeneous community. I think it's rather from a official perspective that I think a lot of indigenous peoples are put into one box, which can become quite disempowering in this context. And I think a response here is actually to depart from the notion of community altogether. So most of the youth collectives I'm working with define themselves as collective. And I think that is something that maybe helps us to go back to people like Castells, who look around issues of like kind of collective consumption or around common struggles that bring people together in certain moments as far more important, and which then help to create productive dialogue and sort of constructively challenging power relations from within a group of people that somehow identifies to belong to the same indigenous group. And I think, I don't know whether that answers the question in great detail, but I think a link I would like to make to your question, Michael, around how can urban development better account for diversity? And I think the lesson here actually for me comes not so much from recent work I've done in Bolivia, but more work I've conducted recently in a larger planning process with Muungano, SDI's affiliate in Nairobi, in Mukuru, where they explicitly departed again from a notion of community be that based around savings, but actually adopted an organizational approach that starts with residents and embraces the fact that by nature, residents are going to be highly different, from structure owners to tenants, from people who live in this place, from people who might be temporarily there. And we need to somehow engage with all of these people through a method of non-violent agitation, which means confronting power relations and confronting conflict from the outset. And I think there exist certain methods and techniques within planning that enable you to do that. So in the case of the Mukuru Special Planning Area, which I accompanied as a researcher, it seemed to be really starting at the level of the individual resident and then moving upwards and embracing conflict in every shape once it emerges, and by engaging in dialogue and in a relatively transparent dialogue with conflicting parties. And I think I find that a better way of embracing diversity. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for the second answer as well. And maybe if I could, we haven't got any more in the Q&A section. Please do post if you have a question, please post it there. But in the meantime, maybe if I can push this back to Stephanie and ask that now you've had some time to think about it, what would be your answer to that question of how and to what extent can urban development practice better account for diversity?
Yeah, thanks. And actually, maybe I'll say just a few brief words on the previous one as well, on Colin's question, because I think there's something also really important here about positionality and sort of that role of research in that space that is very action oriented, and who is defining what is regressive and how you're able to intervene in those sorts of processes and what is even appropriate to intervene in. And it's something that I struggled with a lot in my work. And for instance, ultimately, I didn't find that there was anything sort of action oriented or, any sort of kind of outputs that I could really generate to actually speak about the exclusions of Madesi residents in that context and in that settlement. And that's because there was a lot of risk attached to that. It was not something that I felt I could raise and actually sort of protect the anonymity of people, and became a very complex situation to intervene in. And that being said, I felt I was much more effective at being able to speak toward issues of inequitable access to water, and sort of framing things around, the material resources and who is it, and particularly thinking about things like renters are not able to take, we don't know of any ethnic group, doesn't matter, but sort of thinking about different ways of trying to have that discussion in a way that wasn't necessarily hitting at the core of things that actually, to be honest, I know very little about. I mean, it's a very long and deep history and very difficult to start, making any assumptions about that. And so for me, what was useful then was thinking about these kind of alternate categories that you could use that would be more accessible in that context, as well as thinking about, again, some of those wider processes that were creating those conditions that were undermining solidarity. So in that case, the fact that that program wasn't able to expand and incorporate a whole range of new residents, or the fact that the city was in fact going through this massive construction and sort of population growth and this incredible environmental degradation that was making everybody feel like there was this scarcity of resources they had to kind of hang on to. So I think placing the focus on those issues rather than on communities themselves and the ways in which they're trying to maneuver in deeply, inequitable environments is one way that I've found to do it. But also I think recognizing in my case that there were things that I couldn't at all intervene in, and I'm not quite sure how to manage, particularly when those might be the most sort of sticky, the most risky, the most deep points of inequality that we should be focusing on, and how not to leave those behind, I think for me is still, a question. Yeah, but then coming to yours, to yours, Michael, something, I've been thinking about a lot is the ways in which some of these programs are really, it's about a sort of diverse range of kind of infrastructure or tenure sort of practices, which, collectives are using to try and negotiate either with local authorities amongst themselves, so using these sort of everyday practices as a way of renegotiating some of these relationships. And I think that creates a real sort of dialectic of, on the one hand, possibilities of being able to renegotiate some of these relationships, but I think it also creates new exclusions through that process. So for me, one of the things that's really kind of critical and I guess interesting to think about is how do we understand the ways in which some of these new infrastructure tenure sort of claims making processes are on the one hand expanding for some, but on the other hand, potentially creating new barriers or reinforcing old barriers for others. And I think really practically things that means is one, moving beyond the idea of thinking of projects as static. And I imagine that's very hard when you're working in a kind of development sector and you've got a program and it's got 5 years and you do it like this. But what was very clear in the Nepal case is that it worked very well in the beginning stages and it just didn't scale at all. And that was really problematic and causing a whole range of other issues beyond water. So how do you think about projects as a way that can kind of cope with and adapt to urban change, environmental change over time? The second thing is thinking about, again, I mean, it's been said before, but querying again, what does participation look like? Is participation, does it need to be financial, for instance? What kind of barriers and burdens does that make? And what is this concept of ownership? I mean, I find that a very patronizing term, this idea that we create ownership by sort of requiring some kind of contribution from people for services that they probably should have already had in the first place. And then the third thing is thinking about the kind of multiplicity of practices that people are already using and what are the range of different interventions that we need to be thinking about. So something I didn't talk about, but I think was also clear in this case is that many residents who were unable to access the tank water, what they were doing instead is a whole range of other collective practices to try and, find, maybe they buy a bucket here or there, maybe they buy some expensive jar water, maybe they use the river, maybe they do filtration, maybe they borrow. And I think if we think about not just improving water and improving, through community managed tank systems, but actually through what are the other interventions we might need to do, from protecting wells, from supporting with filtration systems, the other ways that people are unable to access some of the ideal kind of systems, then maybe we can also start to play with a range of different approaches, which might also speak to a range of different needs.
Great, thank you very much, Stephanie. We're sort of nearing the end, so I'd like to ask Vanessa, maybe if you could come in, and I'll give a few words afterwards to Andrea. But Vanessa, do you have any comments on how urban development practice can better account for diversity? Vanessa.
I was mute, yeah. Using pressing of Zoom. I have some comments about that, Michael, but I cannot let this go. I have to comment on community as an analytical concept. I'm sorry, because sure. I think it's very important to understand that, for at least as I understand it, community, and that's why it's a moving target, right? Is something different than a social movement, or is something different. And for example, there's the classical political work of Benedict Anderson about communities are also imagined communities, right? And so, that only captures maybe something of what that term of community is referring to, but I think it refers to something that we cannot apprehend easily, even on the ground. So it speaks to something else than a political movement. It speaks, and perhaps we don't have a better term to speak of it. We don't have, there are many things in this world that we don't have good analytical terms that fit clearly to something in the world. There's a disconnection between what we perceive that joins us with other people and how we actually perform that in space. So I think community as an analytical term is tricky, but I think it's important as well. But your question is super good, Michael. I will tell you something that I learned from Andrea actually. So sorry, Andrea, I was asked first. But is that maybe he can explain more about his case in Lebanon. But what Andrea said is that when you do urban development, that puts at the core of urban development the most vulnerable people. Normally, that urban development helps almost everyone. So perhaps those who are not helped is people who can help themselves. So I think understanding those kind of extreme vulnerabilities, which Stephanie was also highlighting, I think is very important. And then the other thing is this notion of safe spaces that is coming out, and I think it's going to be increasingly important. What does create a safe space? And we are talking about not just the institutional and political context, but about how ourselves, in our gestures, in our speaking, in our talking, who do we give access to and who we don't give access to, how to create places where people feel comfortable to speak. And when they don't feel comfortable to speak, how do we raise topics that we know are important for some people, but they may not be able to talk about it for political reasons or social reasons. So I think, how do we articulate that notion of safe spaces, which in this book we only hint at the end, I think is going to be increasingly important.
Okay, thanks, Vanessa. There are two more questions there. One is from Dan Simpson, and I'm going to direct that to Andrea in just a second. The other is from Nafay Chowdhury, asking from a legal background. And I wonder, Vanessa, if you have any thoughts on this. Coming from a legal background, do communities use law as a means of emancipation, or are laws more of a force for reproducing inequality? What's your experience on that?
Did you want me to answer this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that has come in. Wanted to see if we could quickly get some kind of response on it.
I'm not a legal scholar, but I do know that some communities have found the legal system quite useful sometimes. But somehow I cannot think of an example at the moment. All the examples are coming to my mind at the moment. I don't know if my colleagues.
That's all right. I'm putting you on the spot, so I'm going to ask Andrea to sort of have a word for the end. So maybe Andrea, if you want to think on the legal question as well. Thanks, Vanessa. But Andrea, the other question is from Dan Simpson, saying there are a multiplicity of community types, there are a multiplicity of inequities, there are a multiplicity of identities. Does the book address in some way the intersection and the ways that the people will use different communities and different identities to address different needs, and in some cases different inequalities or inequities? Does the book talk to that? Given its focus on intersectionality, it seems to me that that's quite an important part of what the book is trying to address. Is that right? Andrea.
Okay, so sorry, I wasn't so
Right.
sure you wanted me to go on this one too. I think starting from this last question, I think we could address it more, but I think the book talks about this when it talks about how people perform their identities, and therefore sometimes they use certain collective identities and they're belonging to certain groups in certain ways to get certain benefits, certain advantages, certain needs met, and some other times they use others. And I think that's part of that fluidity and performative of the identity. I think there are a few examples in which this is used. So, for example, in the Zimbabwean case, there is, how people use their belonging and their support for a certain political party in certain ways, or other types of alliances in other ways. So that there is a shifting of those examples and those identities. So that's That's part of you know, performing the one that works better, that collective identity works better for a certain situation. So I think that's probably the angle where we look into that. Very briefly on the legal question, I think there are examples even in the book, but even more broadly about how you know, some, of course, that there is the repressive side of the law, and this we know very well, but then some communities have become better and better in using legal system to resist eviction, for example, or to get services. And some countries in the global south, they got more progressive laws and progressive constitutions, and so people have become able to federate and come together at national levels, and then making collective claims that the state should provide certain services or that some eviction should be blocked. International law has also been used, and for example, through the use of special rapporteurs on specific rights or housing rights or other things. And this has been particularly effective when laws and international laws gets together with international and global solidarity. Then the legal aspects can be very powerful. Very briefly touching upon what Colin was asking about solidarity, I think solidarity between struggles is largely very positive, but this is very positive also when in this solidarity there is such an openness to challenge these ideas that there is always a win-win, so that if my struggles, I come together with your struggles, there's no conflicts between our struggles, between our claims. And sometimes if there is no, and it is created through solidarity, that can help some negotiation on the trade-offs that sometimes take place there. But of course, something that sometimes is called solidarity can be regressive. And this is in those cases where some collective movements, what they represent is elites' interests. And sometimes there are solidarities between different elite interests. And so when some elite interests collude and create solidarity with other elites' interests, that is generally a regressive process. And I've seen that in a lot of places. And this sometimes is presented outside, even by academics, in a way that formalize this kind of struggles. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you, because of time, a deep answer to your question, Michael, but the ways in which development practice can account for diversity better is something that depends on the positionality of the actor. So in the end, we have tried to collect some tactics, and for example, and we did a table. Is not exhaustive, but is the beginning of thinking about how this can take into consideration diversity and intersectionality better. But something that is important, that would be even a first steps that we consider is important, is that for a development agency, local government is being aware of this diversity of needs, aspirations, and the diversity of impact of intervention on different people, looking beyond dominant voices, unpacking simple assumption that the community has one desire, one aspiration. That would be already very important steps. And if you're a community leader, about being clear that while collective identities can be deployed to achieve political goals, there is also risk to silence some people. And so how being explicit about that, how to be explicit about some internal conflicts, and also considering the role of other identities and relationships. So if you are leading a collective claim based on being all tenants, take into consideration also, issues of gender, other kind of issues, take them into your mind if you are a community leader. But there is more in the book on this.
Great, thanks very much, for Andrea. Thank you to everyone for your presentations. That was great. We're exactly at the end of our time, so I'm going to close it here. But I want to thank Andrea, Stephanie, Vanessa, Philip for your contributions. Of course, this is all about launching a book, and Andrea posted in the chat earlier a link to the book. Do go and look for it. Do remember to use the discount code if you do order a copy, which I think is IUDG 2021. If you're into that, I'm not sure what discount you get, but you should get something reasonable off the price. So please do go and get yourself a copy and read it. Hopefully that'll also address some of the questions in some detail that have come up now. Thanks to the team at DPU, Alex McFarlane and co for your support in making this possible, and to the Urban Institute at University of Sheffield, who was jointly hosting this with us at DPU at UCL. So thank you to everyone, and do go and get yourself a copy of the book, and see many of you very soon. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michael.